Okay, it's 3:30, so we'll get started. My name's Martin Gill, and a warm welcome to our 21st Security Thought Leadership webinar. We've been here every Tuesday and Thursday through this crisis, debating an issue of importance to the security sector. And one of the key things about thought leadership is that what it does is invites us to critique the type of security we have now in order to think about and to work towards a better type of security in the future. And today we have a really another engaging topic: security in high-risk environments. What are the challenges and opportunities of operating responsibly? And this issue has been alluded to in a number of the previous webinars. I'm extremely grateful to the International Code of Conduct Association for their support and their interest in taking this subject forward. And also, of course, to our other supporters. Now, what I'm going to do in a minute is I'm going to ask each of our 4 panelists from around the world to introduce themselves. And once they've introduced themselves, I will then go to each of them and ask them for their opening statement. They get 3 minutes to make a statement about this subject. When they've done that, I will then invite you, the audience, to address questions to the panel. Now, there's a question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. Can I ask you please to use that in order to ask your questions? So question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so let's get started then. And let me go first to Michael and ask Michael to introduce. Michael.
Thank you, Martin. As I said, my name is Michael Center. I'm a security advisor with the United Nations Department of Safety and Security, currently posted in Brussels.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And Sean.
I'm Sean McMurtry. I'm security, I like to think sort of social conflict guy. I'm based out in Africa in Kenya, and I've been here the last 20 years.
Thank you, Sean. Charles.
Hi, everyone. Charles Oloo is my name, the Secretary General ASIS Kenya chapter, and a security expert now in security practice.
Thank you. And finally, Jamie.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jamie Williamson. I'm the Executive Director of the International Code of Conduct Association, based here in Geneva.
Thank you very much indeed, Jamie. Okay, so I'm now going to ask each of the panel to make their opening statements. As they're speaking, you might want to think of questions you'd like to address. Question and answer button at the bottom of your panel. Michael, your opening statement, please.
Thank you, Martin. A couple of notes. One, I'd also like to just mention briefly that I am here in a personal capacity, so I won't be speaking on behalf of the United Nations, but more in my experience in high-risk countries. A couple of topics or themes that I continue to think on, especially in these environments, are one, from a security perspective, how do we enable an organization's success in that environment rather than protect the organization? And for me, those are 2 completely different themes, especially with some of the actors that we've seen and the work that they need to do, especially in the humanitarian space. Another theme is looking at risk versus threat. And they are, although threat would be a component of risk, I find that they are uniquely different. And although you may be in what would be considered a high threat environment, that does not necessarily mean those threats will imply a risk to your operations. Underneath that, I'd like to suggest a significant change in the way we think, in that we need to become more analytical in the security environment and move away from the concepts of the old school thinking of guns, gates, and guards. There are many ways to operate, and I think the analysis of the situation is key to doing that. Within that is a better understanding of what I'll call contextual intelligence. A lot of folks have focused lately on emotional intelligence, which is a one-to-one function, but in a contextual intelligence, how does the society or the culture function in that area? What might be their reactions to your actions? And beneath that, acceptance. No matter how much of a fortress we build, no matter how much we may secure a given facility or program, if the people there don't accept our presence, no amount of security will cause us to be able to survive in that environment. And then two final quick comments. One, again, from a security perspective, is customer service. You know, and this links back to enabling the organization. I need to be with the leadership of that organization, understand what are your objectives? What do you wish to achieve? How can I help you do that? And finally, inclusion. I think we as security practitioners need to break out of our bubbles a little bit. We need to spend more time with even that admin assistant. If it's something even as simple as a fire plan, right? We come up with lots of SOPs, but we forget that the human beings have to do it. If it doesn't make sense to those assistants in the offices, then it's not going to make sense to anybody. So putting together working groups of non-security practitioners, I think, builds a better program in the end to bounce ideas. So just a couple ideas out there, and I'll end it there, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael. Sean, your opening statement, please.
Yeah, I want to try and link across to crisis response. I think the vast majority of organizations, particularly those working in complex environments, will be in that recovery resumption phase at the minute. They will be going back into probably contexts which have changed. Political entrepreneurs will have been active. The relationship between the community and the company and the organization is likely to have changed. There's likely to be a high degree of suspicion, potentially a lot of stigma around the company itself, and, you know, as I said, within the community themselves, which could spike intercommunal violence, etc. I also think that there's definitely, at the minute, there's an opportunity to go back differently, not only at that tactical level, at the company level of operations, but I think at the more strategic operational level within the companies themselves. I think there is a sea change around sustainability. I think the vast majority of companies now, investors are demanding it, consumers are demanding it, and I think most companies will be taking a very hard look at how they operate in a sustainable fashion. And I think there's an opportunity for security departments, security providers to look at that sustainability question themselves. I think, you know, there are a number of frameworks. Jamie's, of course, the Code of Conduct Association, which I think is a really solid framework, backed up by a variety of ISOs. And I think also, interestingly, the SDGs offer a real opportunity, especially for majors in complex environments, to really contribute to broader sustainable development goals for the, you know, for the betterment of the world at the minute. And I think that's pretty much me.
Sean, thank you very much indeed. Charles, your opening statement, please.
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Martin. Security in hostile environment is actually a very tricky affair, be it for the governments, be it for the organizations operating in those environments. It's actually an affair that needs to be analyzed properly. And to me, the key thing for the people operating in a hostile environment is to be able to understand what are actually the reasons that are causing the environment to be in hostile situation, and to be able to know what are the parameters, what are all those elements that needs to be considered. What they need to understand is that hostility in an environment is actually denying the citizens opportunity for having and to enjoy the social capitals within that environment. So what they need to do is to understand what are the threats within those particular environments, what are the causes of those particular threats, how are they manifesting themselves, what are the vulnerabilities that need to be dealt with in those particular environments, so that in as much as they actually focus in the operations, they'll be able to understand and be able to relate well with those specific environments. I think another point also is to be able to ensure that there is a social fit within the environment they're operating in. For example, you need to actually understand what type of community you're dealing with, what type of people you're dealing with, the organizations, the governments that you're dealing with, what are the key elements that are actually creating the total breakdown of law and order. How then do you find yourself in those environments so that you can be able to actually create an element of inclusivity in your operations. Finally, the most important thing is to ensure that even in those environments, they actually consider the locals, the community, the services, the needs that the people have, so that they can be able to fit well in those environments. Otherwise, it is a very challenging activity, it's a very challenging affair, but it's manageable if the people operating those environments can be able to appreciate the elements, the factors, the situations, and the actions that are going on the ground.
Charles, thank you very much indeed. And finally, just to say to the audience, the question and answer button at the bottom of your page, if while Jamie's speaking, you'd like to start asking your questions, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. Jamie, your opening statement, please.
Thanks very much, Martin. So I'll speak slowly to give everyone time to put in more questions as well, if need be. What I'll do is maybe take a quick binary approach here in terms of opportunity as well as challenges that we're looking at here, and build on what the three others have said so far. I think an opportunity when we're looking at complex environments, that with the creation of the International Code of Conduct Association in 2013, the international community, I think, finally stepped up to recognize that more had to be done to ensure responsible security in complex environments. So we have the International Code of Conduct, we have an association in place, and I think we have a step in the right direction, both on the side of those that have joined the association, which includes governments, civil society organizations, as well as private security companies, as well as those who've been actively participating in the work of the organization, certain clients, etc. However, and this is where the challenges bits sort of steps in, from a sort of human rights and humanitarian law and international standards perspective, I think we still have a long way to go. You used the verb alluded to as part of your introductions, Martin, and it's clear that in many complex environments, we still have a lack of transparency. We still have ineffective, I think, oversight in many situations. We certainly have not brought in all of the stakeholders, communities, the supply chain, clients, governments, regulators, and I dare say we don't yet have the right level of accountability in many of these environments when something goes wrong. So throughout our discussion, and hopefully today, we can talk about that shared responsibility that everyone has to ensure that security is done properly in those complex environments and meeting those international standards.
Thank you very much indeed. Right, thank you very much indeed, panel. Two questions already in, and we've got one in advance as well. I wonder whether I could ask a more general question first, and perhaps I'll come to Sean with my first question. Sean, how is security doing? It's a general question, but we've been hearing so far about some quite dramatic performances, both good and bad. And my sense is that in these high-risk environments, it's easy to talk about improvements. Is there a long way to go, or are we in a pretty good state? Sean McMurtry first, please.
What about if I answer that in that we've come a long way, as opposed to we've got a long way to go? You know, and I've been involved in the industry the last 20 years. I'm a policeman by background. I come from a conflict-affected society, so I've been around it. I have been in Africa and the Middle East, and I was in the Gulf War during sort of, you know, the boom of the private sector, the private security, and I saw some pretty poor performance, some pretty bad stuff. But we've moved on considerably since then. Same, you think about Nigeria, you think about Colombia back in the 80s. We've moved miles since then. But equally, I think the levels of complexity and the levels of complexity faced by private security providers supporting organizations has also changed. So I think maybe sort of the two roads are running parallel, and I think in due course they will meet. Yeah, so that's succinct. There you go.
Yeah, it is succinct. Okay, let's get to the questions then, and because this is a specific form, I'll come to Michael first. Michael, the question is from Fletch Williams, who's a PhD student at the LSE of Law, and talking about this very point about how well security guns, and he's asking a specific question about the risks for women and members of the LGBT, etc. community. How can non-governmental security practitioners build in the concerns of these groups and members of these groups, where many of the frameworks to do so are orientated towards government? So I'll ask Michael first, then I'll come to Jamie.
Thanks, Martin. I have to admit that is a very, very, very complicated question. I'll even say I'm a little bit challenged on exactly how to answer that. In some cases, it may even be an unanswerable question. It depends on the environment, in all sincerity. What I would say is that while we need to do better at inclusion and working both towards inclusion and acceptance in that area, at the same time, we also, again, have to go back to that contextual intelligence and understand the cultures that we're working in. And it's one thing to build consensus and build acceptance, but we have to be careful that we're not shoving it or imposing it. So I think each environment is going to be uniquely different. There's not going to be a cookie cutter approach, and we're going to have to study each of those in a different fashion.
Very good answer. So I'm going to come to Jamie with the same question, Jamie. I mean, just so you to know, this has been a big issue that's cropped up about the whole role of women in security. We had a webinar on it, Jamie. It's a challenge, I guess. Your thoughts?
I think it's a positive change. I mean, our thoughts, I mean, looking at the question of discrimination, gender-based violence, prevention against sexual exploitation and abuse, the Code of Conduct speaks exactly to that. So you have the principles in place for the International Code of Conduct. In my mind, the biggest challenge is how do you actually implement that in practice? How do you get the companies to actually take cognizance of what the principles require and also apply those based on the contextual realities of where they operate? But we are seeing, and from our work with a number of security companies, we are seeing more and more security companies actually put in sort of gender balance in place, recognizing that there is a need for greater inclusion throughout their services. But also we've seen in some contexts where security companies are female only. They have chosen, and I think there's even a company in Kenya, I think it's Lady Haskari, where effectively it's a female only security company to push that model forward. And we're seeing that in other parts of the world as well. But I think we still have quite a way to go to have full integration and inclusion across the security business.
What about the LGBT though, Jamie? I mean, that doesn't get so much of a mention in this world of security.
I agree. I mean, I think it's Mr. Tough question. I think Michael summed it up quite nicely in his answer. It's a challenging one to answer specifically, but certainly if the industry is serious about being much more inclusive in terms of what it offers, then it has to tackle these kinds of questions and have that comfort to actually deal with these matters and figure out how to make the most of it as part of their own services.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Charles, let me come to you. Question here from Frederic Chenet, and it says, how can local and smaller companies find the resources and the support to reach a good level when it comes to respect human rights? And the point is that there's a cost to getting it right and clients won't pay for it often. Now, of course, the ideal answer is, well, don't take the job, do it ethically. And then people say, don't be naive, people have got to live. Charles, your thoughts on this whole issue?
Thanks, Martin. The smaller companies can actually get it right by redefining their approach and their participation in the whole process of actually provision of security. For example, you find that in most instances, people go into security business with the idea of doing what each and every person has been doing, but that is where they actually fell off or find it difficult. The moment you define your market, the moment you define your, a solution that you want to actually provide, there's a misconception that customers want to pay, yes, which is there, but there's also the other angle that people want to pay for quality. So it actually depends with how you present the quality as a service provider. And we've seen in very many instances whereby if you approach it from the angle that you show the benefits that this customer is going to derive from using or from applying the solution that you're providing, then they would actually give you an ear and they'll go for quality and they'll buy quality. The moment they start buying for quality, they'll be able to pay for those quality and you'll be able to define and actually enter into the, enjoy the benefits of operating within the market. But if you want to do what each and every person is doing the way they are doing it, then definitely you will not be able to be in a position to redefine and to know whether you're actually providing the quality or just providing the services as expected.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Sean here, and a question directly for you, Sean, from Erica Gibbons. And one of the points that Erica makes is that Kenya is starting to see protests in regard to the to an incident by the police. And there are a number of allegations coming from low-income neighbours who have died from police actions during the curfew. I think the real point is, what can be done to build trust in security, be it the police or private security, in these times of crisis? And this is an issue that's cropped up in a number of contexts. I guess in high-risk environments, that's the problems are multiplied enormously. Where do you start with that?
We should ask Charles that question. I think he's probably maybe we could tag team one.
Yes. Let me take up that.
yeah. Okay. There you go. I'll back you up.
Yes, thanks. I think, Martin, you're right. There's been a complaint about the police brutality, and especially from the time that we started the lockdown and the cessation of movement. But I want to say this, that you see, when you look at police force in itself, it's actually a group of well-trained soldiers, but you bring in the issue of the collective behavior. Some of them actually, in the advent of exercising or performing their duties, forget to understand that their main role is to be able to enforce law and order, and they go beyond what is expected, either by wanting to, show that they have the powers, they have the force, or by just wanting to actually prove to their colleagues that, they can do it. But if you look at it, the resultant from that kind of action is actually what waters down what they're doing outside there. We understand that, yes, guidelines are there, rules are put in place, people are supposed to actually be able to follow those guidelines, follow those rules. But in the advent of doing that, there are some elements that you cannot be able to do it 100%, perfect. So in the essence, you end up either you miss time, either you're actually late, but the way the police will actually descend on you is totally different. Now, we've tried as a country to be able to actually enforce and initiate the community policing that can be able to actually bring the police together with the community so that they can be able to gel with the community. But that one also has actually faced a lot of challenge in terms of those informers. You find some of the police officers, and I'm not saying all of them, okay? Even we saw what happened in the US, one police officer actually created a whole havoc in the entire nation and everybody's. So police mentality is actually, following what collective behavior theorists will actually refer to as the individuation of individual in an event where the crowd behavior is concerned. So in as much as the society, the community, the business community, the people would want to actually work with the police, you'll find those finer individuals who actually will want to go astray and be able to use excessive force. And once that one is actually effected, then you'll find that the whole populace will actually be up in arms against the police. So it's something that, yes, the government is trying, society, business community are trying to be able to actually find a way, but you are struggling, but boom, one of them is just out of question.
Let me say thank you to you. Let me come to Jamie. It only seems fair to give Jamie an insight on this issue, which I guess, Jamie, is what you're about. It's a big deal, isn't it? I mean, and Charles is surely right to point to America right now, which is how do you, in these poorer neighbourhoods where there are challenges, get this code of conduct to be really meaningful?
There's plenty of ways, and it is a challenging approach. I mean, ultimately, I think you need to translate, if I dare say, what the code of conduct stands for. I mean, if you look at the code of conduct, you're not looking at sort of science fiction terminology. You're looking at basic fundamental rights in terms of, under what conditions can use of force be used? Can you apprehend individuals? How should guards be treated? How do you select and vet individuals? So these are basic fundamental norms that most local communities should be aware of. Small security companies should easily understand, and regulators as well. So in my mind, it's less about the content. It's more of how do you actually communicate on that and interact with the local communities, with the local actors, to have them understand what the code means in their local context.
Yeah, Jamie, I mean, why is it not, I mean, in a sense, when you talk like that, it sounds very obvious, doesn't it? It sounds like a a logical step. What's the barrier to getting widespread acceptance of these in all communities? Why isn't it obvious?
There are plenty of barriers. I mean, if I had 20 minutes, I'd go on for an hour. If I have 3 minutes, I have to go on for about 4 minutes. I mean, there's plenty of barriers. I mean, if you look at the Code of Conduct, it's a human rights kind of humanitarian law-based instrument. If you look at the security industry, it's a commercially driven industry. And if you look at the context, you're looking at security, national security interest, law enforcement paradigms. You somehow have to bring those different actors together to speak the same language. Many in the sort of security industry do not want to apply the Code of Conduct or start integrating different industry standards to their business because it's too costly in their minds. Some will simply push back in some contexts, like complex environments. You start talking about human rights and humanitarian law, the national authorities will say, no, 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 we don't need your Western human rights in this environment. And then for the local communities, speaking about principles doesn't necessarily make sense. What they want to see is actually action on the ground and change of behavior amongst the actors. So you need to sort of take that blended approach, and there are plenty of barriers that we have to overcome.
Jeremy, thank you for that. I'm going to come to Michael, and a question from you from Gabrielle Prikipalova. I hope I said that right, Gabrielle. And you mentioned about levels of acceptance, and the question is, how do you measure that? I mean, of course, I don't want a technical answer, Michael. It's more a case of presumably that's a doable proposition, is it?
Well, thank you for giving me one a little bit easier to wrap my head around. The short answer to your question is dialogue. You get out with the community leaders. You know who the tribal elders are. You know who the civil society leaders are. And through that dialogue, you will know quickly whether or not your organization or program will be accepted and how you can discuss any challenges there may be. If they say no, then you can bet you have a problem. If they say yes, then generally culturally, then you're probably in pretty good shape. But it's a moving target as well. Make no mistake. Just because today is yes, doesn't mean one of your operations or programs hasn't changed the situation 6 months from now. But it's all about dialogue.
Yeah, I can understand that. And of course, that's easy to talk about in the abstract in a lecture theatre. As others have said, in the real world, it can be a challenge. Michael, let me move on. Let me go to Mark Bramall. I'm going to come to you, Sean. I've given Michael an easy question. Let me give you an easy one. Well, I won't actually. Mark Bramall's got one for you. And it's about the role of intelligence in leading security environments in high-risk environments. Now, you deal with conflict. Clearly, it's important. I'm also interested in the process here, and the clearly it's a given that it's a very important element, I suppose. I wonder how, in practice, good the intelligence is in context. I mean, is this something that's hard to do and always a challenge, or are you well rehearsed? Sean?
No, it's very hard to do. I think intelligence in the form that I think a lot of security practitioners think about it, especially guys and girls from former military backgrounds, I think is very, very hard to plan and to execute successfully in the private sector. And I honestly don't think that we should be doing it. What do you do when you know for a fact that somebody that works for your client, i.e. the government, is actually responsible for some sort of human rights abuse? That's a very, very tricky situation to place a private sector actor in. Of course, morally, we know what the answer is, but it is a very tricky situation. I think, to come back to Michael's point, I think intelligence in complex environments in a private sector context is dialogue. You will know if you're talking. If you're talking, people will understand, you will build trust, you have that open sort of feedback loops. You can see things coming, you can sense things coming, you can get ahead of things in that fashion. And I think dialogue over intelligence would be my answer to that.
Yeah, we hear a lot about dialogue, Charles. I mean, just for your point of view on this issue of intelligence, your thoughts. Let me just give you a chance to have an insight on that one.
Contributing to that one, Martin, intelligence is very, very key factor in actually working with people, whether it's a hostile environment or it's just environment, to be able to actually connect, because for you to be able to actually achieve the results, you must be able to connect with the people and the team that you're working with. So it's important to be able to understand what is the situation they are facing, how are they maneuvering around those situations, then how can you be able to actually empathize with those situations and show them that you're actually part and parcel of what they are going through. Then they will change their perception. They would actually see you as part of them. Then you'll be able to actually operate. Otherwise, intelligence is a very key point in operating, whether it's, as I said, whether it's a hostile environment or it's just any other environment, to be able to connect with the situation and the activities on the ground.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much indeed. Jamie, to you, Gary Shields, a regular contributor to these webinars, is talking about private security in high-risk environments often seems to be outsourced from other nations. And his point is, often seems to be labelled sourced from other nations, arguably more developed and experienced in military police. Is this something which needs to or will change? And if so, how do you see that happening? Jamie?
Can you just repeat that last part of the question in terms of the outsourcing?
Yeah, sorry. So I tried to, it's quite a long question actually, so I tried to abbreviate it. He's arguing about the use of outsourced from other nations and the implications of that. And presumably people are coming from nations that are with a better or more established police and military. When they go into these environments, how expert are they? How skilled are they? What changes need to happen in that arrangement? Presumably it is a regular thing, Jamie, I take it, is it?
Exactly, and I'm looking, I can see the question now popping up on the stream. Yeah. So I think there's 2 or 3 issues maybe to look at. I think the first one is we need to be clear in terms of what set of actors are we talking about. If I'm looking at his question, there's also mention of executive outcomes as part of that discussion. So I think on the one side, we need to be careful that we're not mixing apples and pears and security companies and military contractors, and then as a whole sort of labeling in terms of mercenaries. So let's be clear in terms of what we want to address here. I think, and secondly, in terms of the experience expertise, yeah, I think the model a few years ago was certainly that larger security contractors will bring in their international / expatriate staff to run the show and to manage the operations. But I think the trend that we're seeing today, especially through our work, is it's much more localized security services that we're seeing evolving in many of these complex environments with a local footprint. And that could be partly because of the expertise they have developed themselves, or simply because governments now in those complex environments are putting in place quotas and regulations and licensing regimes not to have foreigners as such coming in to run the security shop, but rather have it as a homegrown business for local security providers.
Which presumably is a positive, is it?
It is a positive to the extent that you can have the right level of oversight and account of transparency and that dialogue that we all keep referring to in terms of what should security actually look like. Because international standards, common international standards, may not necessarily have already been translated into those complex environments. So you need to access those local security providers and work with them in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. Actually, Simon Taylor has just asked a question on similar lines. Relying on private security to self-regulate can only go so far. Are there any mechanisms to support or bolster domestic systems of accountability in complex security environments? Are there ways of ensuring security providers aid domestic regulations? I mean, that interlink between domestic and international code of conduct is often stressed, Jamie, or I mean, you'd hope they'd be complementary, of course.
Oh, they're fully complementary. I mean, all the International Code of Conduct does is actually bring together, as I mentioned earlier, those fundamental principles that we should already find at the local level. In terms of full compliance, you need local government to step in, local regulators to manage the situation, and to integrate what are commonly agreed upon principles into domestic legislation and regulations. There's a huge amount of work that has to be done at the local level in that regard. Yeah,
interesting. Okay, let's move on. Bernard Musembi, a question for Sean. So it's an easy one then, Sean. Very positive about the webinar. My question to Sean was, what would you identify to be the biggest security challenges to oil infrastructure in northern Kenya, and how do you address such concerns? Now, let me just, the whole issue, are you able to answer that question, Sean?
Yeah, I would hope so, yeah.
Okay, good. Well, I won't clarify anymore. I was going to have my own take on it. That's Bernard's question. He's a PhD student from the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, of course.
Good luck in your PhD. twofold, I think. I think one, the proximity of the export pipeline, which comes from northwestern Kenya down to the coast at Lamu, is a problem area because of its proximity to Somalia. I think extremist groups in Somalia have proved their ability to mount cross-border attacks. And I think it's an enormous and very austere remote environment to police. And I think that bottom third, as it's referred to in the industry, would be quite hard to secure. I think the other aspect is what I often refer to as the two circles, or the two concentric circles. The inner circle is that community company conflict, which comes about by bringing large-scale development projects into formerly marginalized areas with low development indices, etc. You put developmental change, positive developmental change into that, and it changes the conflict system, and the organization, the company involved in that then becomes part of that system. The second sort of circle, or the second layer out then, is this pre-existing conflict system, the tension, climate change, exacerbated tensions between communities, inter-community rivalry, which has gone on since God was a boy. It's very, very complicated. And once you start then putting, as I say, developmental change into this, especially change which deals with land, change in the use of land, the strategic or the economic importance of land, then that again will exacerbate conflict between people around you.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I enjoyed the answer. I mean, it's interesting to hear the panelists speak it. This is a topic which we skirted around in previous webinars. Let me maximise the time. Doug Brooks, Jamie, a question for you. Obviously, we're hearing a lot about the USA at the moment, about whether the US government was using private security for crowd control, etc., whether it's appropriate or legal. His question is quite simply, and it's a big one in this country too, it was dominating radio conversation this morning, is it allowed by your guidelines?
Our guidelines don't speak specifically to the inherent functions that, and what private security companies can actually do. We talk about here private security. So the understanding of the code is that these are sort of your classic non-public law enforcement services that are being carried out by the private security companies, protection of individuals, of property and the likes in the private sphere. There is, and the name Doug Brooks is familiar to me, and there is a discourse with regard to the fact that maybe there should be certain activities outsourced to the private security world and the private military world. But I think ultimately it comes down to states to narrow that, because the more you give to the private sector in terms of law enforcement and potential military capacity, the greater risk there are of some potential wrongdoing. So again, the code doesn't specifically say no, but if security companies are involved, then there are clear limits in terms of how they go about applying the sort of measures and what they've been entitled to do so under national law.
Thank you very much indeed. Michael, I'm going to come to you. Colonel Godwin Bayon has asked a very long question, and I'm going to try and summarize it, which is always a danger in these environments. But he makes the point that he's head of First Bank of Nigeria, largest bank in Nigeria and in 7 African countries. He's aware, we're all aware of the challenges in northern part of Nigeria. One of the state governments declared the suspension of detente rebandits. There is now the likelihood of increasing security-related incidents, kidnapping, armed robbery, banditry. Protecting staff, of course, becomes the key issue there. Michael, protecting staff. We've been hearing about this from on the lines in retail environments as they've been spat at, in health environments they've been spat at during this crisis. Obviously, this is a magnitude of change. I guess the point is, how do we make that a priority, and how do we see that as getting people on board the issue?
You do enjoy giving me the ones I'm going to have to put some thought into. And bear with me, and I'm in no way going to make claim to be an expert on what's going on in northern Nigeria. It's well outside of my area right now. However, I think the fundamental answer for me is always equipping your people with knowledge and information so they can make the best risk decisions for themselves in a given environment. And I don't mean by the standard security briefing. In fact, I, like some other staff, have listened to the standard security briefing and my eyes glaze over. We need to seriously engage with staff and talk about, again, I'll use that phrase of the contextual intelligence. What is going on in that area? How do we do a better job of teaching people when they move in a high-risk environment, the presence of the normal, the absence of the normal, or the presence of the abnormal? You know, if you go into a village often and you do some form of work and suddenly those kids you see every Tuesday who are playing in the football pitch are suddenly not there, why? Or the village elders or the mothers who you usually engage with suddenly won't come and talk to you, or those kids who come and ask for candy don't walk up to you. What's wrong? We need to do a better job of teaching those observation skills and those engagement patterns, and then they can do a better job. And then frankly, we also have to do a much better job at, do they need to be there in the first place? Is the risk environment, is the reward of being there worthy of the risk that they're taking on? And I think that's a number of things there, but it's a bit complicated one, but education.
Thank you. Often comes back to that in the end, dialogue and education. Let me go to Charles. Charles, one of the questions that cropped up on our very first webinar, Roger Warwick, based in Italy, made the point that COVID-19 was leading to an undermining of social cohesion. And he's written to me since about this, actually. To what extent has COVID-19 been a particular source of concern, Charles? And where do you see that going? You've got about a minute to answer that very complicated question, Charles.
Thanks, Martin. It's true. So COVID-19 is actually a challenge for social cohesion. And especially if you look at the challenges that comes with it, social distancing, lockdown, cessation of movement. Social cohesion is about peace building in an environment where we actually understand that is a breakdown of law and order. And what is expected in those kind of environment is to bring people together, in-person conversations, group meetings, so that people can be able to understand and mingle around, learn each other, and be able to forgive and move on together. But with the COVID-19 challenges, you're supposed to actually be wide apart, social distancing. You're not supposed to move from, one environment or one community or one area to the next. So it's actually a challenge in terms of now furthering that, proportion of social cohesion. And with the COVID-19 challenges, it's actually proving to be another hurdle, because as the peace builders try to be able to bring that cohesion, they also deal with the challenges that come with the COVID-19.
Thank you very much, Lee. I'm going to ask Jamie just for your final comment, your final comment, but just very briefly, Jamie, a general point about COVID-19, and is that specifically causing a different set and a lengthy set of problems? Jamie? Yeah, no, very quickly, it is context by context. Lockdowns, lack of mobility, rotation for staff, the labeling of private security companies as essential service providers, the protection of the guards themselves, moving from A to B, and their own sort of social distancing, and basically likewise with regards to the clients, how do you deal with that? And then, as going back to your earlier question, they are exposed with lockdowns and rushes on, let's say, supermarkets and shops. The security providers are usually the front line. So they have to deal with local communities that feel oppressed because of the lockdowns. Yeah, thank you very much indeed. It'll be interesting and very important we monitor that one going forward. Okay, I'm now going to ask each of my panel just in a final 20 seconds each to sum up their key takeaway from this webinar, thinking about perhaps going forward from here. Michael, your final comment, please. 20 seconds, please, Michael.
As Sean said, we've come a long way. We've got a lot farther left to go. There are good signs in my own country when you see chiefs of police joining demonstrations. I think, at least in my context, remind police and security we're not unique. We are civilians. We're part of the people who we support. And we need to not forget that we don't have some superior level of authority that is different than the people we serve. Michael, thank you. And to Sean, your final comment, please, Sean.
I think it's around frameworks. As I said, I've been in the industry 20 years. I thought I knew what I was doing until I landed in a very complex situation. And I was very lucky to find frameworks such as the International Code of Conduct for Private Security Companies, the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights, and now most recently the SDGs around 16 and 17, peace, justice, and strong institutions. I would strongly recommend to practitioners working in those environments to grab hold of those frameworks and do as much as you can to push those through internally and externally, because they really help.
Thank you, Sean. Interesting point. Charles, your final statement, 20 seconds, please.
Thanks, Martin. Hostile environments are actually tricky environments to operate in, and whether it's a state, whether it's companies, what is expected is that the people who operate within those environments need, first of all, understand the threats, the risks that are actually underlying, and then be able to define how they can be able to fit in those environments. But for the businesses, where the hostility is where the opportunities are. So you need to actually look for those opportunities and be able to grab them.
Thank you very much indeed. And Jamie, it seems entirely appropriate to leave the final comment to you. Just 20 seconds, please.
20 seconds. The takeout would be, we're on the right track, but then how do we keep building the right culture, leadership, and sense of responsibility along the entire security supply chain in complex environments? And then how do we ensure that we recognize that whilst this is an international issue, it's the local needs and expectations that we have to address?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much indeed. Well, thank you very much indeed to my panel for their insightful views. I have to say I learned a lot from that webinar. We've heard about the issue of high-risk environments, and Jamie was saying beforehand that it's not a subject that we've perhaps dealt with as much as we can. So good foundation laid for thinking differently about that. My thanks to the panel, and my thanks to the International Code of Conduct Association for supporting this particular initiative, as well as our supporters. A very quick note, please, that in terms of being good at security, please don't forget the Outstanding Security Performance Awards are about identifying those who are really good at what they do. Entries are currently open in India, the United States, Benelux, Kenya, Romania and Australia, and in the UK they're open on the 1st of July. Please do everyone just nominate one person or one team or one company for that initiative. Just to say we go through it all again every Tuesday and Thursday. And next Tuesday we're looking at security officers post-COVID-19, an enhanced role or more of the same, looking to examine some of the issues that have cropped up today in the specific context of security officers on the front line. Thank you to Hannah and to Christine in the background who do so much of the work for this, and to you, my audience around the world, and to my panel once again, thank you very much indeed. And wherever you are in the world, stay safe.